During the Eras tour, Taylor Swift had this piano that was painted up with a floral pattern, and my girlfriend said she wanted a box that was painted the same way. Now this was for a Christmas present, and I thought I could do better than just a box. I did it as a jewelry box, and I wanted it to look kind of like the piano. To start with, I had to figure out what I was going to use for the spindles for the front legs of the piano. I had kind of counted on using dollhouse parts, but there aren't really any dollhouse stores around anymore. And the captain's rails that used to be popular way back maybe in the 80s, those didn't fit it either. So I happened to have a lathe that I bought off of Amazon, and it was a really cheap one, and I bought it for parts for something else. I never intended to actually use it as a lathe. Since I couldn't come up with the spindles any other way, I decided I might as well try actually turning them. Surprisingly, with a poplar dowel, and even with the really cheap tools that the lathe came with, I was able to turn it pretty easy. After I got it turned, I fitted a couple of blocks to the end, and I cut it in half using a Japanese razor saw. That was my original plan anyway, was to cut a couple of spindles in half, but I managed to do it with one, and I'm glad, because even though I could turn one spindle, if I had to actually match a pair of them, I think that might have been too much. After they were cut in half, I made a couple of capitals out of another block of poplar, and I block sanded the back of the two spindles flat, and I glued it all on a flat board that was going to end up being the front of the piano, because I didn't need a kicked-in recess in the front to put your legs. It's going to be a jewelry box, so I figured it might as well be closed in. Once they were glued on and the glue was dry, I cut a slot right down the middle of them with my table saw on the back, and that way I could fit a spline in there. And the spline gives it a little more gluing area and makes it a more solid connection, so even if the glue fails, it'll have some sort of mechanical bond holding it on a little bit. I made the sides of the back box using some thicker chunks of poplar with slots cut in them, and I glued them right onto the pre-made up spindle pieces, and that way I could keep the symmetry before I cut them. For the back panel that was actually getting painted, I had originally thought I was going to set up a router jig and just route the whole thing out of a solid chunk, and I kind of wish I had done that, but I did it instead like a cabinet door and actually made separate frames for it, and while I was at it, I cut the slot for the bottom and cut the panel for that. The front ledge is just built up from some thin scrap pieces all stuck together. I cut the ends to match the keyboard trim and glued that on there. By that time I decided that I really did want a rounded over drop panel look to the painted part. So I used the Forstner bit and nibbled away with the table saw to make some little trim pieces to make it look like it was a routed out section instead of being an actual frame and panel assembly like it actually was. Once that was done, I changed my mind about another thing too. I ended up recutting on the inside of the keyboard ends so that I could have a piece that actually matched the keyboard, just like a keyboard cover. Because I had originally thought, I'll just have a flat box top and the ends will look like a keyboard. But it's actually really easy to just cut something that looks like a keyboard cover. So I did, and once it was roughly made, I decided that the best way to hinge the keyboard cover would be to have some little pins with pin springs, like actual literal ballpoint pin springs, to push them back out. So I used my drill and my belt sander to turn some little pins to fit. And I only shot them across the room like 3 or 4 times, so that's pretty good. The actual top, the piano lid itself, I was going to use these mortised quadrant hinges that I got from Rockler. And maybe it's just me, but I don't understand how they work. For me, it's easy enough to mortise the hinges, and then I put the quadrants in, but there was nothing to really keep them in place. And what I ended up doing was put a blob of solder on the ends of each of them on the upper end into the piano lid, and then that retained the quadrants. And I had to mortise out a pretty wide section to have a place for them to go into, and that's okay because I left extra wood on the sides of the piano for just that purpose. I built the base and the little drawer for it off camera because everything was just taking too long, and it's a lot quicker to do that and just stick it on there. Since this is all poplar, there's not a really pronounced wood grain, and I ended up using either trans tint or color tone stain in alcohol, and I hand applied it with a brush, and then once it had soaked in, I rubbed it off a little bit and reapplied it until I got the color and grain pattern I was after. Looking at a bunch of pictures of this piano, it looks to me like after the original floral paint job was applied, it must have gotten beaten up and touched up. And there also are a bunch of the flowers that are applique, like silk flowers that are glued on top. And it didn't start out that way originally. At some point during the tour, they added that on. The proportions I'm using aren't exactly the same as the real thing. I was actually going for a more Barbie-like aesthetic, with the piano being taller than it is in real life. If I had done it with realistic proportions, it would have been a squatter thing than I really intended it to be. So I had to translate the pattern a little bit and change it some. And that's fine with me, because if I was to do this like I was doing a scale model of a piano, it would take me forever. I could get it exactly perfect, but then it wouldn't be ready for Christmas, and it would be rather extravagant compared to what I was actually trying to do. I used artist acrylics and laid the paint on very heavy to add some texture to it, and I did one color of flowers at a time until I finally got through all of them. In the early days of YouTube, I put out a handful of videos, and I've been talking for several years about getting back into making YouTube videos. The problem is I'm a luthier and I build a lot of guitars, but it's really hard to actually film instrument building while you're doing it. And there's a lot of instrument repair channels already out there. And the fact is, I end up doing a lot of arts and crafts type projects and home improvement projects and just straight art projects, as well as any kind of electronics and building instruments. So I thought I might just start a channel called Scatter Shop, and if I was to do that, I could include all the stuff I'm doing in it. And I would hope to come at it from a more approachable place than a lot of these channels. A lot of what's out there is really so polished, it doesn't even seem real. It's like the things the people are doing are so far removed from real life that you can't even hope to get started on it. But everything I'm doing is just all the stuff I'm doing anyway, and I'm just going to film it. So I'm going to try that and see if it goes anywhere. After that, all I had to do was install the hinges and pop the spring pins in for the keyboard cover, and I only lost those twice more. Okay. Anyway, it was a fun little project, and I'm glad I did it. I hope everyone enjoyed seeing it.